Hey guys, in today's video, I'm going to share with you a stunning story of a near-death experience that reveals a profound truth about the nature of God, one that will challenge everything you've ever heard before. Before we start, I want to know, what city are you watching from? Comment below. I'd love to know where you're from. Oh, and if you like transformative stories and reflections on life, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any content. Let's go on this journey together. My name is Landon Whitaker. I'm not an extraordinary person. In fact, I always considered myself quite ordinary. A guy focused on studies, passionate about philosophical debates, and who, for many years, believed that all the answers lay in reason and logic. I never imagined that my life would take such an unexpected turn, or that I would be here, sharing something so personal and profound. The story I'm going to tell is not a search for attention, nor a tale to sell ideas or beliefs. It's simply something I experienced, an experience that transformed every aspect of my existence and made me rethink everything I knew about life, death, and what comes after. Perhaps you will find some meaning in my report. Maybe you think I'm just another person who has gone through something unusual. Either way, these words are my truth. It all happened in Boston, where I was pursuing a postgraduate degree in philosophy. The program was challenging, but exactly what I wanted, to delve into humanity's biggest questions. Who are we? What is the purpose of life? Is there a God? These questions always fascinated me, but they were also a source of tension. He lived with Claire Donovan, a classmate with whom he shared long discussions about faith and spirituality. Claire was a fervent Christian, while I maintained a skeptical, almost arrogant stance. I clearly remember the night everything started to change. We had had a particularly heated argument about the idea that faith was a crutch for those who couldn't deal with reality. Claire, with her almost divine patience, responded with words that only made me angrier. "You think you're so rational, Landon, but your reason is limited by your inability to believe in anything greater than yourself," she said, with her arms crossed and an expression that mixed frustration and compassion. I shot back. "And you think believing in ancient stories written by people who didn't even understand how the world works is the answer to everything? Claire, let's be real." The tone of the conversation escalated until I decided to leave the house. I grabbed my coat, still huffing and puffing, and walked out the door, saying only, "I need air." I didn't know where I was going, but I felt like I needed to get away. By coincidence, or perhaps destiny, who knows, I got a message from Ethan Sullivan, a friend who lived nearby. He was organizing a meeting at his apartment and insisted that I go. I was reluctant, but ended up giving in. It was the distraction I needed. I didn't know it that night, but my life was about to change forever. Boston has always had an air of mixing tradition and modernity, a perfect reflection of what I felt when studying philosophy in one of the most historic cities in the United States. The postgraduate course was a daily challenge, but I faced it with enthusiasm. It was like exploring an infinite puzzle, where each piece revealed more questions than answers. However, the intensity of these studies also had an emotional and psychological cost. I was always on edge, balancing hours of reading, debates, and a constant need to question everything around me. My flatmate, Claire Donovan, was an enigma in her own right. She was as passionate about spirituality as I was about reason. Claire deeply believed in the message of love and redemption that her Christian faith preached, and for her, God was not an abstract concept, but a living, loving presence. To me, this seemed naive at best. "Claire, do you really think the entire universe was created to support our little human lives?" I asked one night while she was on the couch, reading the Bible. "We are just cosmic dust, a coincidence among billions of stars and galaxies." She looked up from her book and replied with disconcerting calm, "And do you really believe that this is all just chance? That there is no purpose, no intention in any of this? It seems to me that that requires more faith than my belief in God." These dialogues were frequent, and despite our differences, we maintained mutual respect until the night that triggered everything. It was a Tuesday, and we had just finished dinner. We began a seemingly trivial discussion about ethics, but soon the topic turned into an analysis of God's role in human morality. Claire argued that faith was an essential guide, while I maintained that ethics could exist independently of any spiritual belief. We create morality to survive as a society, I stated, gesturing intensely. We don't need a God to tell us what's right or wrong. Claire, who rarely lost her temper, countered with rare passion. You speak as if humanity is capable of creating something pure on its own. Landon, history shows that without a greater compass, we fall into chaos and destruction. The discussion took on a more personal tone than usual. Maybe it was the accumulated stress, but her words hit me differently that night. I left the house abruptly, slamming the door harder than I intended. I walked the streets of Boston, the cool night air helping me cool down. That's when I got the message from Ethan. He was the kind of person who always knew how to liven up any room, and his home was often a meeting place for friends looking for a light night out. You have to come, Landon. We are discussing crazy ideas about the meaning of life. It's like you, the message said. I thought about refusing, but the idea of being in a place where no one would question my thoughts or demand more of me was tempting. I responded with a simple, "On my way." This decision seemed so mundane at the time, but it was what set the night's events in motion. Ethan's apartment was in an old building in the heart of Boston, with narrow, creaky steps that had seen decades of parties and gatherings. The place was packed when I arrived, with lively voices overlapping the sound of a smooth jazz playlist. The atmosphere was warm, welcoming, but also a little chaotic, just what I needed to turn off my mind for a few hours. "Landon, finally, man! I thought you wouldn't come," Ethan said when he saw me at the door, with a bottle of wine in my hand and his signature smile. He was the kind of person who made you feel like you were the only person in the room, even in a crowd. "I couldn't miss this chance to hear your absurd ideas about life," I replied, trying to sound lighter than I felt. Ethan laughed and handed me a glass. At first, the conversation was relaxed. We talked about philosophy, music, and even the latest campus news. But as the bowls piled up, I lost count of how much I had drunk. The laughter became louder, the debates more heated, and without realizing it, I was exceeding my limits. At one point, a friend of Ethan's proposed a toast to the big questions in life that no one can answer. Everyone laughed and raised their glasses. Me too. The phrase, despite being said in a joking tone, resonated strangely with me, perhaps because of the argument I had with Claire hours before. As the night progressed, I felt an uneasiness grow. Alcohol wasn't bringing me the relief I was hoping for. If anything, it seemed to amplify the confusion in my mind. I decided it was time to leave. "Ethan, thanks for the night, but I'm going with it," I said, as I put on my coat. "He is sure." "It's still early," he replied, but I was already determined. I needed fresh air and silence. When I reached the stairs of the building, I realized that I was more affected than I imagined. Each step felt tilted, and my vision was slightly blurred. Still, I moved forward, holding onto the railing for balance. Halfway there, I slipped. It all happened so quickly. My foot lost contact with the step, my body was thrown forward, and gravity did the rest. The impact was brutal. I felt my head hit something hard, and the pain was so intense that it seemed to erase everything else. I heard distant voices, hurried footsteps, and then silence. A deep, almost comforting silence. When I had some consciousness again, I was in a state of semi-lucidity. I didn't know where I was, but I perceived fragments of reality. The sound of a siren in the distance, the touch of unfamiliar hands moving me, urgent voices that spoke words I couldn't understand. "Severe head trauma. We're going to need an urgent CT scan," a male voice said, while another replied, "He's losing a lot of blood. Pressure dropping." All of this seemed to happen on a distant plane. There was no pain, just a strange numbness. Then something changed. Suddenly I felt like I was floating, like my body had become too light to be held by gravity. When I looked down, I saw something I will never forget. My own body, limp, being carried by paramedics. I saw the blood on the floor and the look of concern on Ethan's face, which looked like he was praying. It was at that moment that I realized something far beyond understanding was happening. When I regained consciousness, it wasn't like waking up from a deep sleep or coming back to consciousness after fainting. It was different, more intense and confusing. I was somewhere, but I wasn't in my body. He hovered above the scene, like an invisible observer, seeing everything from a perspective that shouldn't be possible. The atmosphere was cold and clinical. The emergency room was in full swing. Fluorescent lights illuminated the scene as doctors and nurses worked frantically around my body. My body, there I was, lying on a gurney, pale and still, with blood staining the side of my head and tubes and wires connected to what appeared to be a monitoring machine. "Pressure plummeting. We're going to need intubation," said one of the doctors as he adjusted something close to my face. "Urgent CT scan. We need to rule out a brain hemorrhage," shouted another female voice as a nurse rushed over with a tray full of instruments. None of it seemed real. I felt no pain, fear, or anxiety. He just watched. It was like watching a movie that, strangely enough, I was a part of, but without feeling directly involved. As the seconds passed, or maybe it was minutes, I'm not sure, I realized I could move freely, but not in the conventional way. It didn't walk. It didn't float. It was as if my thoughts transported me. When I wanted to get closer, instantly I was closer. When I wanted to see the doctors, faces, I was taken to them. I looked at the serious face of one of the surgeons, a man in his 50s, with determined eyes and deep wrinkles on his forehead. He was clearly dealing with the tension of the situation. A younger nurse at his side seemed nervous but focused, squeezing a ventilation bag while looking at the monitors. And then, something even stranger happened. As the doctors worked, I realized I could hear more than their words. It was as if he could pick up on your thoughts or intentions. The main surgeon thought, "He's young. We can't lose him. Focus." The nurse, on the other hand, had flashes of concern. "It reminds me of my brother. Please let him be okay." This expanded perception fascinated me. I was connected to the scene in a way I had never experienced before. I wasn't just a spectator. I felt part of something bigger. As he continued to watch, something changed. I felt a force pull me away from the room. It wasn't like I was being kicked out, but more like I was being called out. There was a smoothness to this movement, as if it were natural and inevitable. When I looked back, I saw my body once again. He looked so small, so vulnerable, surrounded by people fighting to keep him alive. I didn't feel sadness or fear, just a strange acceptance, as if I knew it was part of something bigger. Suddenly, the emergency room disappeared. Everything around me turned into light, a soft but infinitely bright light. It wasn't the kind of light that hurts the eyes. It was welcoming, comforting, almost like a hug. And it was at that moment that I realized I was going somewhere else. The light around me was not just illumination. It was alive, pulsating, as if it had its own essence. It was difficult to describe what I felt at that moment, but perhaps the closest word is integration. There was no fear, no doubt. I felt like I was where I was supposed to be, like that light was both my destination and my origin. I looked around me and realized that there was no floor or ceiling. I was in a vast, infinite space with no borders or limits. The light did not come from a specific point, but permeated everything, as if it were part of me and the environment at the same time. There was such an intense serenity that for a moment I completely forgot that I had left anything behind. My mind, however, still asked questions. Where am I? What is happening? There was no one to answer, but somehow the answer seemed to be there, present in the air. As I explored this new reality, I noticed something in the distance. A door. It wasn't like the doors we know. It was not made of wood or metal, but seemed to be formed of pure light, vibrant and welcoming. At the same time, there was an invisible force that drew me to her. It was a silent but irresistible invitation. I walked, or maybe I just moved, toward the door. Every step or thought of movement seemed to bring me closer. When I arrived before her, I noticed details that were impossible to fully describe. It seemed to have constantly moving patterns, like waves or filaments of energy. These patterns were mesmerizing and conveyed a sense of purpose. I reached out my hand, or what felt like my hand, to touch the door. As soon as I did, I felt a deep vibration, a current of energy that coursed through my entire being. The door slowly opened, but it didn't reveal what was on the other side. Instead, an invisible force pulled me gently but firmly, as if I were being carried by a current. The transition was like passing through a veil. There was no sensation of physical movement, but of total change. The light around me intensified for a moment, and then, suddenly, I was somewhere else. What I saw was of a beauty that transcends words. A vast, endless field stretched out in front of me, with grass that looked like it was made of velvet, glowing faintly under a golden light. The air was incredibly pure, filled with an aroma reminiscent of flowers, but without being overpowering. Everything seemed to vibrate with life. In the distance, there were majestic trees, with leaves that sparkled as if they were made of crystal. There was a river, whose waters were so clear that it seemed to contain stars in its flow. The ambient sound was soft music, as if nature itself was singing. It was a place of absolute peace, where every fiber of my being felt welcomed. As I walked through this field, I felt something I had never experienced before, a complete connection with everything around me. It wasn't just a landscape, it was an extension of myself. Every leaf, every breath of wind seemed to be connected to me in a way I couldn't explain. It was as if I were part of a larger whole, a living, unified organism. However, even in this state of serenity, one question remained in my mind. Why am I here? Before I could explore further, something unexpected caught my eye in the distance. As I walked through the infinite field, the feeling of peace remained, but something began to change. I noticed a sound in the distance, different from the soft melody that filled the room. It was something more intense, like human voices mixed with muffled sobs. A knot began to form inside me, something that I didn't fully understand, but that seemed to call to me. I advanced toward the sound, guided by an instinctive force. As I approached, the landscape around me also seemed to transform. The vegetation remained lush, but gave way to a more defined space, almost like a clearing surrounded by trees. There, a group of people were gathered in a semicircle. They were dressed in black, their heads lowered in reverence or pain. As I approached, my heart sank. I recognized the faces. They were my family and friends. Claire was there, their hands clasped in prayer. My mother, Evelyn, sobbed as she was supported by my father, Thomas, who, despite looking strong, had red, teary eyes. The scene hit me like a punch. No, this can't be happening, I muttered, although my voice didn't seem to make a sound. I walked towards them, trying to attract attention. I am here. I am fine. But no one reacted. It was as if I were invisible. I tried to touch my mother's shoulder, but my hand passed through her, as if I were made of air. In the center of the semicircle was a coffin. My coffin. Just looking at him made my heart sink. It was surreal, unacceptable. It was like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. A pastor stood before the group, speaking in a calm, compassionate voice. Landon was a son, a friend, a thinker. He questioned the world, but also inspired those around him. Today, we return you to the universe, with the certainty that your journey does not end here. My mother let out a louder cry, clinging to my father's arm. Claire closed her eyes tightly, as if her prayer was her last attempt to connect with me. It was unbearable to see them like this, so devastated, without being able to do anything to comfort them. I kept trying to interact, screaming, crying, begging for someone to listen to me. But then, a different feeling came over me. I realized there was an invisible barrier between me and them. It wasn't a physical barrier, but something spiritual, something I couldn't overcome. It was at that moment that I understood. I was no longer part of their world. I had crossed over to another plane. Acceptance did not come easily. Part of me wanted to remain in that place of peace, in that vibrant, infinite field. But another part desperately wanted to go back, to hug my mother, to apologize to Claire, to tell Ethan that I forgave him for not preventing the accident. I felt torn between two worlds. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It wasn't a physical voice, but something that echoed inside me. It's not time yet. The words were simple, but they carried an incomparable weight. Before I could fully understand what they meant, I felt a force begin to pull me back. The field, my family, the coffin, everything began to dissolve before me. The golden light returned, enveloping and comforting. I was being taken, not by my will, but by something greater. I didn't fight it. I just accepted it, with the vague hope that, somehow, there would still be time to change things. The return movement was as sudden as the initial transition to the other realm. The golden light that surrounded me began to slowly dissipate, revealing the emergency room once again. Now the view was different. Everything seemed darker, more frantic, almost as if I were returning to a less perfect, harsher reality. Suddenly, there I was again, watching my body. He was still lying on the stretcher, pale and motionless, while the medical team worked urgently. The atmosphere seemed charged with tension, as if every second was crucial. A doctor, sweaty and exhausted, was leaning over my chest, performing chest compressions, while another team member prepared a defibrillator. "Prepare for shock," said one of them, his voice firm but full of concern. The heart monitor next to it beeped in continuous tones, indicating that my heart was stopped. "Come on, kid," the doctor murmured, almost like a prayer. "Don't give up now." As I watched the scene, I noticed something that shocked me. The continuous tone of the monitor remained unchanged, and the doctors began to exchange worried glances. The tense silence was interrupted by a male voice, probably the chief surgeon. "Time of death, 3:27 a.m., he declared with a heavy sigh. The words hit me like a punch. They were declaring me dead. Even in my separated state, this was almost impossible to process. "What do you mean, dead?" I was here, conscious, observing everything. The medical team began to slowly walk away one by one. Some hung their heads in resignation, while others appeared to be dealing with the guilt of yet another life lost in their care. The doctor performing compressions hesitated before letting go of my hands. "Sorry, kid," she whispered, visibly crestfallen. Before I could react to that statement, something changed again. The room, with its dense, tension-filled atmosphere, began to disappear like a mist dissipating. In its place, the light reappeared, but this time, the light felt different, more intense, more welcoming, and charged with a sense of purpose. I was once again in that space of peace, surrounded by a luminosity that seemed to come from all sides. But now, there was something more. A specific glow, almost like a shape, began to emerge in front of me. The luminous form had no defined contours, but it was unmistakably conscious. His presence radiated love, wisdom, and a sense of wholeness that no words could capture. It was not human, nor was it something that could be labeled as an angel or a deity in the traditional sense. It was simply a presence. Without using words, the presence began to communicate with me. The messages were instantaneous and clear, beamed directly into my consciousness. "You haven't finished your mission yet," was the first thing I understood. "Your time here is a mistake. You must go back." To go back? I thought, without speaking out loud. Why? For what? I saw my funeral. There's nothing for me there. The presence responded with something that felt like a hug made of light. "You didn't see everything. There is more for you to accomplish, more people to touch. Your journey is not yet complete." As soon as this message was conveyed, I felt the force pull me again. This time, there was no resistance. I knew I needed to go back, even though I didn't fully understand why. The light began to fade, and once again, I found myself in the emergency room. This time, it was different. Instead of observing my body, I felt a sudden shock wave, as if I had been sucked back into it. My senses began to return, one at a time. First came the pain, a throbbing pain in my head and chest, but also the sound of the heart monitor that now indicated an unstable rhythm. "He's back!" shouted someone, and the medical team rushed back into action. The doctors were in disbelief. One of them, the same one who had declared my death minutes before, seemed to not believe what he was seeing. "I've never seen anything like this," he said, as he adjusted the monitors. Clinically, he was dead. The doctor who had previously apologized smiled in relief, with tears in her eyes. "Well, it looks like someone up there had another idea." As my consciousness stabilized, I realized that something profound had happened. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but one thing was clear. I was back, and that was no coincidence. Upon returning to my body, something in me had changed forever. Even though I was physically present in the hospital, my mind and soul seemed to carry fragments of the place to which I had been taken. But it was during recovery, between moments of absolute silence and flashes of physical pain, that the memories of what I experienced in the light began to emerge clearly. As I lay in bed, with tubes connected to my body and machines monitoring my vital signs. Images and sensations flooded my consciousness. It was like watching a movie I hadn't realized was recording. I remembered the luminous presence, the wordless communication, and the indescribable peace of that space beyond the world. But most of all, what stood out was the revelation of something that transcended all my beliefs and skepticisms. The presence I found in the light was not a human figure, nor something that could be shaped by earthly concepts. That was God, but not the God described in texts or sermons. It was an infinite energy, a vibrant field that permeated all things. As I stood before that light, I understood something that transcends words. God was not an isolated entity, separate from his creation, but the very essence of existence. It was pure love, a force of unity that connects every living being, every atom in the universe. God was not a judgmental paternal figure, as often portrayed, but a presence that offered freedom, understanding, and integration. The presence conveyed truths that resonated with me like ancient but forgotten knowledge. "You've always known me," was the first message I understood, not in words or dogmas, but in the connection you feel with everything around you. I am not separate from you. I am you, just as I am everyone else. This revelation hit me like a bolt of lightning. My entire view of the world was reconfigured. I realized that religions, although well-intentioned, often limited the understanding of divinity. They created structures and narratives that made the infinite accessible to the human mind, but at the same time distorted its true nature. There was a moment when I questioned, even in the midst of that state of profound peace, what about religions? Are they all wrong? The answer came clear, but without judgment. Religions are reflections of human limitations. They try to explain what cannot be fully explained. Some touch the truth, others distort it, but they all have a purpose: to help in the search, even if they fail to capture the whole. It was a message without rancor or criticism, just an invitation to accept that the divine is something much greater than any doctrine can encompass. As I listened to these revelations, I felt something I had never experienced before, a complete connection with everything that existed. It was as if every human being, every leaf, every star in the sky was part of a larger symphony, orchestrated by the same force that I now recognized as God. I understood that the essence of this force was love, not a conditional love, but a love that transcends right and wrong, human or divine. A love that simply and, when I came to, I was still in the hospital, surrounded by doctors and machines, but now there was something different inside me. I wasn't the same Landon Whitaker anymore. I had a glimpse of something that would change my perspective forever. Looking up at the white ceiling of the hospital room, I whispered, almost without realizing it, "I got it." In that moment, I felt a lightness, as if I had left behind the weight of years of doubt and arrogance. I no longer needed to prove anything. There was something bigger, something that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. After the revelation about the true nature of God, another wave of understanding began to form within me. It was as if the luminous presence was still there, connected to me, ready to share more. This time, it wasn't about what God was, but about what I should do. Still on the threshold between consciousness and what seemed like another dimension, I felt a voice echoing inside me. It wasn't a physical sound, but something that resonated directly in my soul. The voice was masculine, firm, but full of kindness and authority. He conveyed a sense of immense wisdom and experience. "Landon," she began, calling me by name in a way that seemed to cut through layers of my identity. "You have not yet completed your journey. Your mission on Earth is not over." For a moment, I was confused. Mission? What mission? My life until then seemed like a succession of studies and debates, with no clear objective other than to satisfy my intellectual curiosity. What could I have left unfinished? The voice continued, as if it already knew my doubts. "You have been blessed with the ability to question and challenge. This is the gift you must use, not to divide, but to unite. Your purpose is not to prove yourself right, but to help others see beyond their own limitations." These words struck something deep inside me. I had always been proud of my intellect and argumentative abilities, but at that moment, I realized how I had often used these gifts to distance myself from people rather than connect with them. The voice continued, as if showing me glimpses of what was to come. You will encounter challenges. There will be times when your faith in this experience will be tested. But remember, your purpose is to live meaningfully, spreading kindness and understanding. Although I didn't have a literal vision of what would happen, I felt the message was clear. My life from here on out shouldn't just be about me, but about the impact I could have on others. This impact did not need to be grand or public. It was in small actions, in everyday gestures, that I would find my true purpose. Now, you must choose, said the voice, changing its tone to something more solemn. You can remain here, in this state of peace, or return to your body to fulfill your mission. For a moment, the idea of staying there, in that welcoming light, was tempting. There was no pain, no doubt, no weight of expectations. But at the same time, the image of my mother, Claire, Ethan, and the others who were at my funeral flashed through my mind. They were still in the world, feeling my absence. I knew that if I could return, I want to go back, I thought. Or maybe I said it out loud. I want to do what needs to be done. The voice's response was simple, but loaded with meaning. Then go, and remember, you will never be alone. As the light around me began to fade, I felt a last wave of energy wash over me. It was as if I were being carried by a gentle but irresistible current. The endless field, the crystal trees, the river of stars, all of it disappeared, replaced by the fluorescent lights of the hospital. Suddenly, I felt my body again. The pain returned, throbbing and insistent, but I also felt something else, a strength that hadn't existed before. It was as if a part of the light was still with me, a constant reminder of what I had experienced. As I slowly opened my eyes, I saw my mother's face. She was holding my hand, tears streaming down her face. Upon realizing that I was conscious, she let out a scream of joy mixed with relief. "You're back, Landon! You're back!" she said, squeezing my hand tightly. I couldn't respond immediately. I was still processing everything, but deep down I knew I was back for a reason. I didn't fully understand what the future held, but I was certain my life would never be the same. Coming back to life was like emerging from a deep, turbulent ocean, feeling the weight of my body again, my heavy breathing, and the throbbing pain that radiated through my head and chest. The fluorescent lights of the hospital flickered almost cruelly, in contrast to the warm, infinite glow I had left behind. My first clear vision was the face of my mother, Evelyn. His eyes were red and teary, but now they shone with a mix of surprise and joy. She was holding my hand so tightly that I almost felt pain, but the expression on her face was one of pure relief. "Landon," she said, her voice breaking as she caressed my face. "You're back. My God, you're back." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and felt like it was full of sand. Still, I managed to whisper, "Mom, I'm here." She started crying again, covering her mouth with her hand as she shook her head. They said you weren't coming back. I prayed so hard, Landon. I knew God wouldn't take you away from me." His words reminded me of the promise I heard in the light, that I had a mission and that my journey was not yet over. What happened there was not just a physical return. It was a second chance, an opportunity to rewrite my life. As my mother cried beside me, the doctors and nurses began to enter the room, looking at me as if I were a walking miracle. The surgeon, who had pronounced me dead, was among them, clearly disconcerted. You're the definition of impossible," he said, approaching the bed. "I have never seen anything like this. Clinically, you were dead. We tried everything, but you came back." The nurse who had apologized moments before my death smiled at me, her tears also reflecting a mix of relief and fascination. "I don't know what happened, but we're so glad you're here." I just nodded. There was no way to explain what I experienced, at least not at that moment. Everything seemed surreal. The miracle they described had less to do with medical procedures and more to do with something that transcended what any equipment or technique could achieve. In the days that followed, I slowly regained my strength. Claire came to visit me in the hospital, bringing a small flower arrangement and a guilty expression that didn't seem to suit her. "Landon," she said, hesitating at the door before entering. "I don't know how to apologize." "Apologize? Why?" I asked, still weak but curious. Because if we hadn't argued, you wouldn't have left that night. I wouldn't have, you know." She sat next to me, holding my hand. Her eyes were full of tears, and the vulnerability she rarely showed touched me deeply. "Claire," I began, my voice still hoarse, "it wasn't your fault. None of this was anyone's fault. And if it's any consolation, something very important happened because of it. Something I needed." She looked at me with confusion, but didn't press. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, with a small but sincere smile. When I left the hospital about 2 weeks later, I felt like I was stepping into a new world. The colors seemed brighter, the sounds richer, and even the cold Boston wind had a different meaning. Every detail of everyday life felt like a gift, proof that I was there for a reason. I did not announce my experience to everyone. I didn't write a book or become a speaker on near-death experiences, but those close to me noticed the difference. I was kinder, more patient, and most of all, more connected to the people around me. My mother firmly believed that my survival was a miracle granted by God in answer to her prayers. Claire, although hesitant to believe in the supernatural, accepted that something inexplicable had happened. As for me, I carried the experience with me, knowing that it would be my compass from now on. After everything that happened, my life was no longer the same. It wasn't just the physical return to the world, but the invisible baggage I brought from that experience. I didn't know how to explain everything, to myself or to others, but I knew it carried truths that could never be ignored. The first thing I realized when I got back into my routine was how precious and fragile life was. Before the accident, I saw life as a series of challenges to be overcome, as if each academic or intellectual achievement was a stepping stone to something greater. After the near-death experience, I realized that life was not about achievements, but about connections. I started to value the simple moments, the conversations with my mother while she made coffee, the spontaneous laughs with Ethan, and even the debates with Claire, which now had a much more respectful and collaborative tone. One day, while walking through the park, I noticed something that would have gone unnoticed before: the way the sunlight passed through the leaves of the trees, creating dancing patterns on the ground. I stood there for minutes, just watching, feeling an inexplicable gratitude for being alive to witness something so simple and beautiful. About 6 months after the accident, I experienced what I can only describe as a second spiritual experience. It was during an asthma attack, something I've dealt with my entire life. It was a cold night, and my emergency pump wasn't working. I felt my body weaken as my breath became shorter and shorter. Suddenly, the familiar feeling returned. My body felt light, as if I was leaving the physical plane again. I saw a tunnel of light, similar to the first time, but now it was accompanied by luminous spheres floating around. Somehow, I knew those spheres were souls, each carrying a unique energy, but all connected by something greater. Just like the previous experience, I was pulled back before I crossed any boundaries. I woke up with my breathing stabilized, still panting, but alive. That second experience reinforced my conviction that there is much more to life than we can see or understand. A few weeks after my asthma attack, I had a dream, or at least that's what I initially thought. In the dream, I saw myself in an ethereal space where a radiant figure, who appeared to be Jesus, stood before an endless line of souls. He was not the Jesus of traditional paintings, but he exuded a golden light that was impossible to ignore. I saw how each soul went through an assessment, not with words, but with feelings and images that showed their actions and intentions. Some souls deeply repented and received a kind of welcome. Others, shrouded in darkness, seemed unable to move forward. The scene was both frightening and deeply revealing. When I woke up, I was reflecting on what I had seen. The vision was not about fear or condemnation, but about responsibility. Each choice, each action left a mark, and that was what determined the path of souls. One of the most emotional moments I experienced after the accident was a vision of my deceased mother. It happened while I was meditating, something I started practicing after my return. In the vision, she appeared in a field similar to the one I visited during my near-death experience. Her face was serene, and she conveyed a clear message without saying a word. "I'm fine, and you will be too." This vision brought a mixture of sadness and joy. It was a reminder that spiritual connections remain, even when physical separation is inevitable. The near-death experience has not only transformed the way I see life, but also how I relate to the divine and to others. I realized that I don't need definitive answers for everything, but rather an open heart to learn and grow. I started to treat people with more patience and empathy, understanding that everyone has their own struggles. My faith is not a traditional faith, but a trust in the universal love and connection that unites us all. If someone asked me what I learned from all of this, I would say, life is a gift, and our purpose is simple: to love, learn, and leave the world a little better than we found it.